Hello, my name is Christina Flores, and I'll be going over the strategy teaching words in relation to other words from Chapter 8. Teaching vocabulary is a crucial step in teaching students how to comprehend what they read. And in Chapter 8, we go over concepts, knowledge, and vocabulary. The strategy I want to discuss is teaching words in relation to other words. By teaching this strategy, you're encouraging students to use their background knowledge that can relate to the new word they are learning. Oftentimes, kids will read a story and they won't understand what they're reading because they don't know the vocabulary or the definition behind the new words that they are introduced to in the book. That's why I think it's important to introduce this specific strategy because it also comes with a couple of activities that are pretty beneficial in teaching students how to define these new words that they are coming across. So the first activity I want to go over under this strategy is exclusion. So to the exclusion activity, what it is, it's basically where you get a bunch of words and the student has to decide what word doesn't belong in the group. The way I would introduce this new activity, I would use it as a transition worksheet. So whenever my students come in like during first period and they're waiting to eat their breakfast or they're waiting for me to count roll, I would simply pass out a worksheet like this, and it would have 3 questions. The first question would be, which of these words don't belong? And there would be 5 specific words. First one would be coffee, soup, summer, ice cream, or heater. So my students would read through these words and they would try to decide what words relate with each other and what words don't. While they're doing this, they're generating their background knowledge. They're bringing out the similarities between the words. They're figuring out why these words don't match with each other and how they do match. So like for the first question, they would look at coffee. They would think, okay, coffee is something to drink. It's something hot. Soup, it's also something to eat. It's also something hot. Summer, hot. Ice cream, it's cold. A heater is hot, but it's not something to eat. So right there, they're already relating. They'll relate the ice cream, soup, and coffee are all something that they eat. But then they'll also see that coffee, soup, summer, and heater are all hot things. Then the second question, I would, again, which of these words don't belong? And I have here, it would be car, boat, train, bus, streetlight. So already they'll look at these words and they'll figure out how these words relate to each other. But then they'll also see, okay, some of these things, all of these things are obviously for the street, the road. But then some of these things move, and most of these things move except for the street light, and they would generate their background knowledge and decide that the street light's the one that doesn't belong there. So that would be my first activity. I think this is a perfect activity for like a transition, whether you're coming in from recess. I could already have it placed on their desk to settle them down, or whether they're coming in to their first period homeroom and their brains are still waking up. It will be a good exercise to generate their little minds into school day already. So the second topic activity I want to go over is from Chapter 9. It's called Story Frames. Story frames is a good strategy to use in elementary schools, or basically for anyone who hasn't grasped the concept of comprehending what they're reading. So oftentimes students will they'll read a book and they'll be excellent readers, but they won't understand what they're reading. They'll just simply go through it, and you'll ask them a question and they won't understand. They won't know how to answer because they read everything, but it's all over the place. So I think a story frame would be good for students like these because it'll help them gather all of their jumbled thoughts and put it into one piece of paper. Well, into one idea. So I created something like this, and it's basically a skeletal paragraph with just transition words connecting each other. So the way I would start off this activity, I would bring out a book. I have a book here. I would bring out Frog and Toad or something within their reading level. And the book story I would use is Spring. So I would have them pick out the book, or I would have copies of the book that I want them to read. And then I would first, before I give them this, I would actually make them write out, like, I would make them organize the concepts of the story. So, like, first, before I give them the story frame, I would first have them figure out the story plot. Then I would also, the setting, I would make them figure out what the setting is, character analysis. I'll make them compare the characters, and I would also make them figure out the story problem so they already have an idea of what's happening in the story. And with that information, they'll be able to fill out this story frame, which will actually get them into the idea of comprehending what's happened. So the way a story frame works, I have here the story frame, the title of the book. Then I started off in the story, and the problem starts when. So they have to write out when did the problem happen in the story. Then they have to, it's basically them writing their own story. Then I would go over with them and I go, what happens after that? After that, then when they fill that one out, it's next. They write out what happens next. Then, and finally, it'll be the problem is solved when. So I think this is a good little activity strategy because it's also something that they could get used to. It'll also be something that they can use in the future. It could be a learning tactic. I remember my elementary teachers using this when I was younger, and it's still a strategy I use to this day to figure out the text I'm reading in class. I can remember myself using it like throughout all of my ACT tests and reading classes in college. So I think it's a perfect tool for students to get the hang of and for teachers to introduce, especially if they're having trouble comprehending what they're reading. And let's see. So that's it for my little activity.